Good day, everybody. I apologize for the slight delay on this video. First of all, I think it's going to be several parts, okay? Because we're going to shift now, as we talked about what this image of God thing is, how it relates, the different creation stories. I want to begin by noting that we have to address the issue of what is generally called sin. Okay. And the reason we have to address this is that sin is an anthropological issue. It's not a divine issue. It's our issue. It's not God's issue. Okay. It's only an issue for God in as much as God has to make plans to deal with it. But sin is our issue. There is, at least in the certain circles that I see, and I find this to be true, particularly in the charismatic and finished works tradition, the grace movement, the so-called grace movement. Um, Again, very bad theological thinking, especially when it comes to talking about sin. These groups, many in these groups, many that are popular on YouTube and have their own little schools, and some of you probably listen to, I don't know. They're very poor when it comes to anthropology. They're starting to understand, and I say starting to understand because these people really haven't made the important connection yet. Just a second, I got to kill a spider. Never mind, just disappeared. Um, these people make very bad theological connections. They're moving in the right direction, okay? But it's as though they have bullet train tracks and they're still trying to do steam locomotive theology. Okay, they're not seeing things quick enough and fast enough. Part of that's that they're not cruciform. They don't have a theology of the cross. Okay, they've turned that whole thing into some kind of total Christus Victor thing, and they've eliminated sin. And so they'll say there is no such thing as sin. Some years back, I was a decade ago or more, I was invited into a group by Andre Rabbah, and it was like 4 or 5 thousand of these types. And I was in there for a little while trying to figure out what in the world they were doing. And then this one lady comes on and how she's married with kids, but she met her soulmate on Facebook. She's moving to Australia, and it's not a sin. It's all everything's good with God because there is no more sin. So any choice she makes is not sinful. And I just thought that was a bit ludicrous, you know. But I see them saying that there's no such thing as sin, or sin no longer exists. We don't have a sinful nature. They just, what they're trying to do is they're trying to explain sin in relation to God rather than explaining God in relation to sin. So they start down here and they poorly define what sin is. They go, sin is breaking the law. That's how they define sin, breaking the law. And because the new covenant comes in, there's no more law. That means there's no more sin. Okay? They're partly correct, aren't they? Just partly. Because phenomenologically, in terms of human reality, when you look out at the world, if you cannot say there is great sin in the world, then you're not looking at the world through the eyes of the gospel. That would be like saying on Good Friday, or the day Jesus died, whatever, Good Thursday, Good Friday, it would be like saying, oh, there was no sin in the world that day. What the Roman soldiers did wasn't sin. What the Sanhedrin did wasn't sin. What the disciples who denied and betrayed and fled, that wasn't sin. That's silly. It's absurd. On Good Friday, we committed the greatest sin of all, we human beings. Not just the Sanhedrin, not just the Roman soldiers, not just the disciples. The point of the death of Jesus is that if he had come in our time, we would have done the same thing. That's the proof in the pudding. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? You bet your ass I was, because I did it for a long time as an adult. It's very easy to join the mob and point fingers. Scapegoats aren't selected, they're random. The thing that makes a scapegoat is when the imitation begins of the finger pointing. Otherwise, you can have people out there, potential scapegoats, but there's not enough imitation. Once the imitation in the crowd comes along, boom, now you have a scapegoat. These thinkers, outthinkers, I don't even know if I should call them that, these faux theological type wannabes, have failed by beginning with this very poor definition of sin. Okay, that's first. Second, one of the things that the 20th century has brought us, and it's a great gain, is a rethinking of the metaphors that we use and the importance of those metaphors as they basically form the frame and help us construct our narratives. Now, there's a book we're going to discuss here. It's Gary Anderson's Sin, A History. One of the brilliant things about this book, when we get to discussing it, is the way he noticed how the early Jewish tradition perceives sin as guilt, and then it later becomes sin as debt. This is within Judaism, okay? And of course, I look at that and I see, of course, the growing transactional theory. Of course, this all makes sense to me why this is there and why in Jesus Judaism, sin is debt. Also equates to, if you're a poor person, you're a debtor, and then you're in sin. See, there's a logic there, and it's a way to keep people oppressed, is what it is. Okay. But back to my point, phenomenologically, we look around the world and we see it's broken, it's violent, it's unjust. And as we look at the world, you look at human history, just look at it. Okay. Have we made progress as a species? Yes, we've made rather remarkable progress just in our lifetimes. But you go to the beginning of the 20th century, folks, they have different rates of, you have extreme poverty, you have moderate poverty, et cetera, and your classification of what resources are available to you. At the beginning of the 20th century, and I don't know the exact number, I can't give it to you, but it was an absurd number of how many people on the planet lived in extreme poverty. I mean, like 40, 50% or more. At the end of the 20th century, we brought that down to 5 or 6%. That's progress. There is progress in the world, okay? Walter Wink, at the end of his major trilogy on the powers, in his Engaging the Powers, at the very end, shows how the 20th century produced more nonviolent changes than we think. Where nonviolent resistance affected political change without war. It's stunning when you look at this 3.5 pages, single space of all these things that happened without war, without violence. Okay. So have we progressed? Yes, in some ways. Okay. But we go through cycles as a species. Okay. We go through cycles. You can look at human history, folks, and there are cycles. We are currently at the end of a 1,000-year cycle, and boom, things change. We're at the end of a 500-year cycle. We're at the end of a 100-year cycle. We're at the end of a 50-year business cycle. We're at the end of a decade cycle. I mean, all these cycles colliding, folks. It's just history. Things sometimes get really, really crappy. World War I, World War II, and now probably World War III. Okay, but it's not going to be as apocalyptic as everybody says, end of the world stuff. No, it'll be bad. It'll be bad. There may be even some tactical nukes used hither and yon. I don't know. We will certainly, I think, begin to see a civil war in America. We'll see all kinds of terrible events. Just be careful out there. Just be careful for the next 4 or 5 years, and be aware, and you'll be fine. But the world's broken. And for these people to come out and say, there's no sin, I can't sin, nobody sins, it's like God looks at us and he doesn't see sin. Well, when God looks at the human species right now, if he doesn't see sin, God is blind. And we know that's not the case. light is never blind. How do we account for all this in light of the gospel and the effects of the gospel? I mean, you can look again throughout Western history and you can see profound effects of the gospel. This is one of the beautiful things about the work of Scott Cowdell in Australia and his book on the gospel and secular modernity. I mean, folks, Thomas Torrance talked about the importance of the shift, the Athanasian shift in thinking, the way Athanasius thought, the epistemology, and that of Albert Einstein. Okay? Christianity has done many good things for the world. Okay? Democratization. And interestingly, we're going to discuss another book by Alan Jacobs of Wheaton College, Original Sin, A Cultural History. One of the fun things about that book is the way he shows in the Middle Ages how, as the doctrine of hell develops, it becomes democratized. Yes, the rich could be in hell, so all the poor people at least have something to hope for, right? And the importance of the democratization of hell. So the dog's barking, just ignore her. But how do we account for these things? And so we've discussed previously that we have various types of creation stories in the Bible, and we also have various types of the origin stories of evil. Now, when I go and I look at these origin stories, and I begin with Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, when I begin with Torah, I have a narrative in Genesis 2 about a command. And in that command, sorry, got it. That command is a law. It implies obedience or disobedience, okay? It's really important to note in that narrative that even Adam does something, okay? But sin enters with Cain. I think this is going to be important when we come to Paul, who talks about the transgression of one man. Sin entered into the world. It did, but Adam transgressed. Didn't sin, he transgressed. He disobeyed the command and imitated the woman. She then became his model, and humanity got locked out at that point of having the divine as their model. That's the so-called fall. You see, we locked ourselves out and into human imitation. Now, again, that's mythic. It's not a literal man, a literal woman. No, it's mythic. It's telling us about the rabbis or the scribes as they're writing this text, as they're thinking these things through. They are really seeing very, very clearly that as they look back and they have this God they're learning about, so they begin thinking now about these other questions. Where did evil come from? And stuff that was being thought of in Persia by Zoroaster. The Jews were also thinking about this. This was something that was going on in the ancient Near East back then. Why? And Heraclitus comes along in Greece, and several hundred, 500 years before Jesus, and asks these questions. So it's not like these were settled in any way, but the human species was trying to understand why the world was broken, especially if you had any notion of a God that was good. And then, of course, they'll split things up and there's this good spiritual God, but the creator God kind of really screwed it up. And so, yeah, you know these stories, okay? But the first origin story of evil is this rabbinic narrative, this anthropological narrative that has been exploited in the finest manner by the Girardians, okay? We have been able, I think, to take that Genesis 2, 3, 4 through 11, that second creation narrative. And I think we've been able to show how that myth describes human culture and human behavior and human activity and the origin of evil in the human being, not some external thing that we'll talk about in a moment. This is a brilliant text anthropologically, and of course it ends with sacrifice. And so what Rene Girard saw he wasn't making up out of thin air. There is a structure to this narrative. It's a drama. We're going to talk about drama too a little bit. Told you I was excited about this lecture. There's so much to talk about because I'm going to try and give you a different frame, a different way of talking about this that is able to take into account the phenomenological, that which is real in the human world, and at the same time, the gospel and the power of the gospel and how we can truly understand sin, as James Allison puts it, through Easter eyes. Okay. So the first origin story has to do with Torah. Now, there's a second origin story, and that's Zoroaster. And Zoroaster over in Persia, Zoroaster is an amazing figure. If you've never had a chance, at least go look up the Wikipedia article on him and read about him. It won't take you that long. And wonderful, brilliant mind, but shaped has literally probably done more to shape the way the world thinks than any other human being except for Jesus. And then the church kind of gummed that up, but I don't know about modern day Zoroastrian, so don't ask me. I'm just talking about the historical Zoroaster. But he comes up with this mimetic principle, this good God and this bad God. And the reason there's good in the world is because there's the good God, and the reason there's bad in the world because they're the bad God, and they're equal powers. Sometimes one is winning, the other's losing. Sometimes it's this, and there's a yin and a yang to human history. You see, it explains how human history works. That's what that belief system does. Okay. The Genesis writer, because there's multiple writers in that text. There's four of them. The Genesis writers are not seeing things that way. They're at all. They don't have a bad God. There is no bad God in the text. There's human beings and a talking snake. It's not a bad God. Okay. It's only later, after the Jews get carted off to Babylon, where Zoroastrian religion is reigned supreme, that they will begin to build that thinking into their Jewish thinking, okay? And they will begin to, as they come back from the exile over the next several hundred years, begin to move they will begin to develop what we would call a devil or a Satan concept, okay? Not a second God, but that because God can't do evil, okay? God cannot do evil. So they have a second figure there, a Satan figure, very obviously very powerful figure, because that figure is also in the royal court of the angels, the seraphim and the cherubim and the other archangels, has access to God in the mythic prologue of Job. And in Zechariah, that figure also has access, you see. So the Jews, while not buying into this dualism, bought into kind of a form of it by creating an alternative second power. Okay. And that, of course, becomes now the myth that gets exploited in the Book of the Watchers in First Enoch, where you have the Satan and the lieutenants who are all named in there, right? And they do the rebellion in heaven, and then they get cast down to Hades, Tartarus, wherever they're sent to, the Sheol, I don't know, but they were sent to a very dark place. And the funny part of that story is one of the lieutenants says to Angel Gabriel or Raphael, he says, you think God could let like 10% of us stay out and the rest you could just go there and God message gets to God and God says, sure. That's why there's evil in the world, because they asked for part of them to be able to remain behind. So we're just dealing with that. I just find this humorous as a way of explaining evil. I think it's hilarious because we've moved from the sublime of Genesis 2 through 11 to the absurdity of the Book of Enoch. But it's that absurdity that dominates Second Temple Jewish thinking. Okay? So when Jesus or Paul or, well, the writer of the fourth gospel doesn't use the term Satan. He uses the term the devil. But whenever any writer refers in the New Testament to this figure, it's very easy for us to assume that they're saying the same thing about that figure that Second Temple Judaism is saying, and that's not the case. The New Testament writers, the historical Jesus, Paul, and the writer to the fourth gospel, are not going to understand the Satan category concept within that Second Temple system the same way that Second Temple Judaism does. They will demythologize the Satan. That's what the New Testament does. Boltzmann, bless his heart, greatest thinker next to Karl Barth in the 20th century, truly a genius, a wonderful theological thinker. Boltzmann thought we needed to demythologize the supernatural, the divine, out of the New Testament, and then we're left with an anthropology, primarily that of Paul and John. I don't disagree with we're left with an anthropology, primarily that of Paul and John. They're really thinking this stuff through, okay? But I disagree that it was the divine that needed to be demythologized. It was the devil that needed to be demythologized so that we could then build a frame, a theology that it was in tune with the good gospel, that God is light and there's no darkness in God, okay? That God is love, there's no dark side to God, and also account for the incredible brokenness of the human species, here now evolved after several million years, particularly the last 100,000 years, particularly the last 10,000 years, and especially in the last 100 years. We are barely keeping up, folks. Part of it is that we've now developed technology which outpaces us, okay? We're now second. We're going to get left in the dust here. That's another topic for another day. The only writer in the New Testament that is going to use the Satan concept the same way it's used in Second Temple Judaism is the Revelator, the writer of the book of Revelation. And it's important to note for that writer that Satan is cast out, okay? And that's what creates the tribulation that will occur. Now, a third possibility will come into existence sometime around the year, well, the 5th or 6th century BCE in Isaiah. And that's Isaiah 45. It's part of the servant songs. And there, God says, I create both good and evil. God takes responsibility in that text for the whole thing, okay? And the term there is ra, evil, and we're going to talk about the importance of these concepts when it comes to the rabbi's view of human psychology, the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov, the good impulse, the bad impulse, the angel on one shoulder, the demon on the other. And but God takes responsibility. I don't think that text or that viewpoint took real hold in Judaism. Again, the Hanukkah narrative with the fallen angels dominated. There's another approach to this, and that's in the Apostle Paul, who recapitulates the Torah narrative in Romans 5:12 through 21. Again, when we come to talking in these next lectures, and this is good stuff, folks. I hope you're appreciating it. We're going to kind of walk through Paul's argument in Romans 5:12 through 21. And you understand the logic of that argument recapitulates that of Torah. It's also a rejection of the anthropology of this Hanukkah Second Temple Judaism. Paul has begun taking the gospel and deconstructing his Judaism the way we take the gospel and deconstruct our Christianity. Okay? Same process. And I've already given you what I believe is proof of that between the early Thessalonian letters and the later authentic letters. Okay, so there's, I think, already proof of that process. Why do we have multiple stories of the origin of evil? If we have the Torah Paul narrative, that's disobedience. We have the Zoroaster First Enoch narrative. And also, by the way, we would want to throw in the rather really strange text of the Nephilim in the early part of Genesis. The Nephilim in Genesis don't appear evil, okay? They're just larger than life, kind of like Atlantean men in Plato's Atlantis myth, okay? Which is another version of the Nephilim myth. Okay, they're the ones that brought us science. They brought us uh, uh, all these gifts, magic and music and this and that and the other, farming and agriculture, everything. The Nephilim story, it fits in there very awkwardly, if you've noticed. It really doesn't belong. It makes no sense, except to say that from the writer's viewpoint, there was a time when there were giants of old, and whether that we're talking tall in stature, whether we're talking, tall in culture, I don't know. But that narrative is there, and it gets incorporated into the later Second Temple Habakkuk, and then, of course, the Christian story about this origin of evil with these creepy things and these demonic human beings and this and that and the other. The Genesis stories, Genesis 1 through 2:3 and Genesis 2:4 through 11. The two stories are not chronological, folks. They're not chronological. You don't have first, it's everything's perfect, and then we introduce evil into reality. Okay. They're not chronological. The first narrative is eschatological. The first creation narrative ends the way it's all going to end, as very, very good. Okay. There's no fall or redemption in that first narrative. All the writer sees is that what God makes is good and will end up being just the way God wants it. That's the writer. It's eschatology. Okay. The second narrative is different. The second narrative begins similarly to the first narrative with several days of creation, and then boom, jumps right into the human being, to the male first and then the female. And all the emphasis is anthropological, okay? But it's about the anthropology in its brokenness. I want to show you something. The first creation narrative, John Walton does this in his book, In the Beginning. The first creation narrative, and by the way, Margaret Barker also does this, is structured as a temple. The creation is structured as a temple. And as you go from each day, you move closer and closer and closer each day to the Holy of Holies, which is day 6, the creation of the human. The human being is in the Holy of Holies in this creation story, my friend. The Holy of Holies where God and the human meet. Okay? Second creation story is not framed as a temple narrative. By the way, this temple narrative is very important because this temple has no blood. When you look at other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, okay, they're using the temple structure and they have blood. The Genesis story is bloodless, a bloodless creation narrative. That should tell you something about the character of God, the creator, okay? The second narrative, Genesis 2, begins right away. It zooms through all the other stuff and just gets right away to the human being. And where the first story is a story of creation structures as a temple with the human in the center, bloodless and without sacrifice. The second retains but slight echoes of this, now placing the human in a paradise with legislation. Okay, so there is your solution to the issue of sin. When the fundamentalist comes along and says sin is disobedience to the law, they're not incorrect. That is correct. Okay. The problem here is that they don't then begin to understand the relationship between the command, the exacerbation of desire, and sin. That correlation in the Genesis text that Paul makes in Romans 7, that exact correlation. Okay. So when I say Paul's recapitulating the Torah reading rather than the Second Temple reading or other readings of sin, he is. And this is very good. So we have these two creation stories, right? But there's another Jewish creation story. Did you know this? There's another Jewish creation story. What is that creation story? Creation story is found in the prologue to the Gospel of John. Dog's gonna bark, the mailman's here. Hang on a second, I gotta pause the video. Pause.